Could the road to the Winds of Winter finally be coming to an end? Fans of A Song of Ice and Fire are skeptical of anything that would give them hope, but we might have a little hope for them today. George R.R. Martin ended last year with a post on his Not a Blog, and he shared updates on everything from Winds to HBO. Let's take some time to dive into the post. First, as you'd expect from one of these updates, a lot of things have been holding the author back. George R.R. Martin is one of the busiest writers in the world, which is something that has always annoyed some of his diehard fans. As HBO began charting the future course of their Game of Thrones franchise, Martin has been spending a lot of time working with them on various projects. If you hadn't heard, there's a new Game of Thrones prequel out, and it's called House of the Dragon. It's pretty good, you should watch it. And just like in the early years of Game of Thrones, Martin has been heavily involved in the production of the series. In this post though, Martin talks a bit more about the efforts he's making into the second season of the show. He also says that he helped develop a number of other spin-offs, some of which are proving more promising than others, but none of which have been greenlit yet. Elsewhere in the TV world, Martin is also developing an adaptation of the Wild Cards anthology novels for the Peacock streaming service. While that show is currently adapting Fort Freak, you can probably guess that the anthology format will be replicated in the show. Along with all this work, Martin also spoke about delays caused by travel. He's still sticking to his policy of never traveling with his computer, meaning he only writes on the occasions when he's at home. Now, we'll cut some of that negativity with some good news. On a recent appearance on Stephen Colbert's Tuning Out the News, where famous people get interviewed by the animated host, like Dr. Ike Bloom, George got some serious roasting. The host called him a struggling writer and said that George was pathetic and unable to meet deadlines. In order to get the writer some help, Bloom rings up James Patterson, the guy who turns out novels like a factory. You can imagine that he was quite confused about George's holdup. He described George's writer's block as writer's constipation, but then he joked about himself having writer's diarrhea. What a strange segment to feature two legendary writers on. Anyway, Patterson advised Martin to upgrade his technology. This fact might be fun or horrifying, but George does all of his writing on a computer from decades ago, running WordStar on MS-DOS. In other words, he's writing on hardware that might genuinely be a decade or so older than you. We didn't forget this was supposed to be a positive segment. At one point, Patterson asks his victim how far along George really was in his writing, to which he replies that he's got 1,100-ish pages down. With just 400 to 500 pages left, he's tantalizingly close to the finish line. Patterson's advice there is for George is to break his material down into 3 novels, which is something George regrets trying with A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. On top of that, we also got a sneak peek at a storyline in the book. In another recent blog post, we learned that George's most recent additions to the book have had to do with Casterly Rock. House Lannister has been very important to the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. They were one of the 5 kings in the War of the 5 Kings, and Tywin's children have been major characters throughout the story. But while the books have visited the homes of all the major characters, including getting as close to the ruins of Valyria as they dare, we've never visited Casterly Rock. What is it like? What riches do they have? How well will they stand up to the crisis looming over Westeros? The post specifically talks about wonders and terrors too, which is a real eyebrow raiser. George teased in the post that all these questions and more are set to be answered when the Winds of Winter finally ends up in our hands. He says that the place is inspired by the Rock of Gibraltar, and he also mentions that Casterly Rock hasn't withstood an ape invasion. The fact that this man can raise so many questions in just a handful of lines really shows the writer's talent for storytelling. We're super excited to find out what's going on at Casterly Rock and what the apes have to do with it. Now, that last bit of advice Patterson offered is something fans have been suggesting for a while. Practically speaking, do all these books really have to be so long? We suppose it gives readers a lot to chew on while the author pounds out the follow-up, but if Martin was willing to drop shorter novels, fans might be happier. The books would come out quicker, which puts less pressure on the writer to deliver content faster than he can manage. Meanwhile, you gotta figure that it's easier to write a couple of smaller books than one gigantic doorstopper. The most famous successful example of this in the fantasy genre, no less, was the Wheel of Time series. Like A Song of Ice and Fire, this series was also made up of monstrously huge novels, with just the 2004 prequel coming in at 334 pages. While these books were coming out at a relatively consistent clip, author Robert Jordan passed away in 2007 while working on the 12th and final tome. His wife, with his blessing, handed all of his material to Brandon Sanderson, who proceeded to complete the story in 3 books. Not short ones either. We're talking expansive tomes. Imagine what a nightmare Jordan would have had trying to make his work into 1 book. Moving on. Though this approach worked for Jordan, it didn't work for George R.R. Martin. A long time ago, George R.R. Martin was penning the follow-up to A Storm of Swords. After writing and abandoning a partial draft of the book, he started over and dubbed it A Feast for Crows, while also announcing that the sequel would be titled A Dance with Dragons. After overshooting his September 2001 release date by about 4 years, Martin revealed that his manuscript for the book had ballooned over 1,500 pages, with 100 more to go. His publisher suggested the same thing James Patterson did: split the books. George went along with it at the time, though he didn't chop the book in half as you'd expect. Instead, he divided the books along geographical lines, with Feast covering the southern regions and Dance heading to the north and checking with Daenerys in the east. This didn't pan out for him all that well. Feast came out that same year since it was basically already done, but Dance wouldn't hit bookstores until a whopping 6 years later, coinciding with the Game of Thrones show. Based on this experience, Martin has said a number of times that fans shouldn't hold their breaths for him to try this again. You'll either get all of the Winds of Winter, or you'll get none of it, and it looks like we're so close to getting all of Winds right now. Next up, could 2023 finally be the year we see the Winds of Winter? We think it's a bit of a stretch, and not just because of George's history with this book. Many writers can knock out 300-ish page books on a yearly basis, but most novels aren't as complex or detailed as A Song of Ice and Fire. With regard to this book, George has spoken a lot about all the backtracking and rewrites he's had to do as he developed the story. It looks like writing 400 pages of the Winds of Winter is like writing 800 pages of a James Patterson book. It won't help that George is working on all these projects at the same time. These were the things that slowed him down in 2022 after all, and he probably won't be freed up from them until the end of the year. Now 2024, that is a more realistic time frame. House of the Dragon second season will complete a lot of its production in 2023, and the same will be true for the Wildcard show. Not to mention the fact that the Winds of Winter will make for a very exciting marketing tactic for the upcoming season of the show. Not that it needs a book to support it. In fact, it might be that House of the Dragon will help promote Winds of Winter, since it's taken so long to come out that many fans of the series will have lost interest in it. Let's end today's video by looking back at the 12-year saga of the Winds of Winter. Remember how A Dance with Dragons took a really long time to come out? Well, part of the reason for that is George ended up with a bunch of content that had to be excised from that book as well, shunting it to Winds. As a result, even before Dance was published, the author had 5 chapters of Wind ready to go, but he didn't dive into writing new content for the book till 2012, having wrapped up publicity for Dance and Game of Thrones. The author has published sample chapters from Winds occasionally. December of 2011 saw the release of the first of these samples, a Theon chapter. In 2012, Martin was reading more samples from the book, which sure makes it sound like he was making good progress on the novel. Somewhere down the line though, George seemed to have hit a brick wall. There was an infamous post in the first week of 2016 where George revealed that he missed several deadlines from his publisher to get the book out before the 6th season of Game of Thrones. 2016 also saw the last of the sample chapters. It looks like being locked down at home gave George the time and stamina to crank out a huge chunk of the book. In a real sense, we might not have gotten Winds at all if not for the pandemic. So thanks, COVID-19. But that's it for today's video. Let us know in the comment section below whether you think we'll get the Winds of Winter in the 2020s at all. But whatever you do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.